Today we're out here in Oregon with the all-new 2018 Volvo XC60. The XC60 is a very important model for Volvo because this is one of their most important vehicles worldwide and especially in the United States. The XC60 doesn't just look like the Volvo XC90's Mini-Me, this actually is basically a shrunken XC90. The XC90 is of course Volvo's large three-row crossover that has had rave reviews since it was launched about 2 years ago. And this is the latest member of this family. It's also closely related to the Volvo S90 and the upcoming Volvo S60. If you were worried that Volvo would make the XC60 a little bit cheaper inside and out, don't be worried, they really just have shrunken down an XC90. Let's take a look. Because we haven't gotten our hands on the XC60 for a complete week, this is going to be one of our shorter style reviews, and it's going to be focusing primarily on the T8 plug-in hybrid model that we're driving right here. Do expect a complete review on the T6 and T8 coming up soon, but we can get our hands on one back at home. The first thing you'll notice about the XC60, of course, is how much it looks like the XC90. That's part of Volvo's new design. And of course, how much wider it is than the previous generation XC60. This is a few inches wider and it really shows up front. They've also made the vehicle a little bit lower to the ground and they've squared things off up front definitely. We have Volvo's Thor's Hammer headlamps, which are full LED headlamp modules. They steer in the corners as well. And you notice that the center rib turns into a turn signal over there on the passenger side. Like Volvo's larger three-row crossover, this model has the very square proportions that we see in the rest of the modern Volvo lineup and the longer hood and more rear-wheel drive proportions, which are of course interesting because this is still a transverse engine under the hood and still starts out as a front-wheel drive vehicle. It all has to do with the general design of Volvo's new platform that enables them to push the wheels a little bit further forward than we found in previous generations and gives it that more rear-wheel drive look. As I said before, this is the two-row crossover, not the three-row crossover, so we have seating for 5 inside, not seating for 7. Versus the last generation XC60, the overall length is up 2 inches to 184.6 inches long. This is actually about 1 inch longer than a BMW X3. But interestingly enough, this really is right about the same size as the average compact crossover in America. So this is almost the same size as Nissan Rogue or a Toyota RAV4. The biggest difference between this and the previous generation is the wheelbase, which is the distance between the front wheels and the back wheels. That is up considerably to 112.8 inches. That's about a 3-inch stretch versus the last model. And that really pays dividends when it comes to rear seat legroom, which was a complaint about the last generation XC60. Because this XC60 continues Volvo's trend of giving us a slightly sexier rear profile, cargo area in the back is a little bit down. The model we're driving today has the optional air ride suspension, so we can lower the suspension to enable easier cargo loading in the back. It lowers it just a little bit to make it easier to put large items in the car. The rear end design is sort of a merging of the previous generation XC60, the XC90, and of course Volvo's S90 sedan with this red portion of the lamp module that curves on into the trunk lid. As you can see over there on the other side of the car, the turn signals are red in America. They are, of course, amber in other world markets. Volvo says that this was a style choice for North America, not a legislation requirement. Below the hatch, we have some chrome, some reflectors, parking sensors, and of course, dual integrated exhaust. These are actually real dual integrated exhausts. They aren't faux units like we see in some of the competition. Under the hood, we find the same 3 drivetrains as most of Volvo's models in America. Things start out with a 2-liter 4-cylinder turbocharged engine that they're calling T5. That produces 250 horsepower and 258 pound-feet of torque. That's an improvement of 10 horsepower over the previous XC60. Then we have a T6, which takes the same basic engine and adds a supercharger. That's basically what we're seeing under this hood. That brings power up to 316 horsepower and 295 pound-feet of torque, a 14 horsepower improvement over last year. And then of course we have the absolutely insane T8 model, because if turbocharging and supercharging wasn't enough, they'll add a hybrid system for you, and that brings the total in this car up to 400 horsepower and 472 pound-feet of torque. They do that by adding a 45 horsepower electric motor under the hood to the existing turbocharged and supercharged engine. That also gives you an extra 111 pound-feet of torque. And then they put an 87 horsepower electric motor on the rear axle, completing the picture for 400 horsepower total. You might be wondering why the total isn't higher. The reason is because the 87 horsepower motor in the back and the 45 horsepower motor up front and the 316 horsepower turbocharged and supercharged engine under the hood don't produce their peak horsepower and torque at the same time. And where those lines all cross, we get 400 horsepower and 472 pound-feet. The T8 model is not just a hybrid, it's a plug-in hybrid, and you'll find a 10.4 kilowatt-hour lithium-ion battery pack right here under the center console. Volvo puts the battery here for a few reasons. It keeps the weight nice and central in the vehicle, and it also is the safest place for the battery. Because if you were to try and impact this battery in an accident, you'd have to crush the entire side of the car, or the entire back of the car, or the entire front of the car. Now obviously the battery being here precludes a mechanical all-wheel drive system, and that's why we find that 87 horsepower electric motor in the back. So interestingly enough, when the XC60 is driving along in electric-only mode, it's a rear-wheel drive vehicle. When it's driving along in gasoline-only mode, it's a front-wheel drive vehicle. The battery is good for an all-electric range of 18 miles, which is an improvement on the larger XC90, and when everything is working together in its hybrid mode, it'll give you 26 miles per gallon combined, which is pretty good for a 400 horsepower crossover. As I've come to expect from Volvo, the front seats are very, very comfortable, and I'm going to give these 10 out of 10 points. These are exceptionally comfortable for the compact crossover segment and for really most luxury cars in general. The model that we're driving has the optional up-level seats, which include a power extending thigh cushion, power inflatable bolsters, four-way adjustable lumbar support, and an active massage function. The active massage function is actually one of the better ones in the luxury industry, even including vehicles that are much more expensive than the XC60. The driver gets a tilt telescopic steering column that is manual with a decent range of motion, and the passenger seat has exactly the same range of motion as the driver, including the heated functionality, the ventilated functionality, and the four-way adjustable lumbar support with massage. Hopping out back, rear seat comfort improves to 9 out of 10 points if you get the gasoline version, 8 out of 10 points if you get the hybrid model. The reason is not because of the outboard sitting positions. I definitely have more than enough headroom here, even though we have the large panoramic moonroof. I still have about 1.5 inches left, and I still have several inches of legroom. It's all about the middle seat right here, because the T8 model's battery actually extends a little bit further back into the rear passenger footwell, and that means the center person doesn't have quite as much room as they do in the gas model. If I move all the way over to the right side of the vehicle, this front seat is all the way back in its tracks, and I still have a decent amount of legroom for a vehicle this size. Keep in mind again that vehicles like the XC60, the Q5, the GLC, or the X3 are about the same size as a Honda CR-V or a Toyota RAV4. Out back we find 29.7 cubic feet of storage space, which is pretty respectable for the luxury compact crossover segment. This is a little bit more than we find in the modern Q5 or the SQ5. Under the cargo area load floor, we find 2 different storage compartments. The first one is where we find the charging cable. Volvo includes a dual voltage charging cable, which is a nice touch. You can, of course, remove this little divider from the vehicle. And if we lift it all the way up, this is where we find the 12-volt battery, the pressure tanks for the optional air suspension, and some additional storage. We don't find a spare tire back here, so instead we have a tire inflator kit and basically a can of Fix-A-Flat right back here. As we take a quick spin around the interior, keep in mind we are in essentially the top-end inscription trim, so we have a lot of options that you don't find in the base model, including this extra-large panoramic moonroof. Up front, we have height-adjustable seatbelts for the driver and the front passenger, and inscription embossed on the front headrests. The model that we're driving has the optional Napa leather upholstery. These seats are both heated and ventilated, and with a very small Swedish flag over here on the side. As I said before, this offers inflatable side bolsters, and then we have an extending thigh cushion that you can see right down here. As we see with most vehicles in this category, the front doors are made from almost entirely soft touch plastics. Really the only hard plastics you find are right here inside the bottle holder area. A point of differentiation between this and the larger XC90 is that although we do find an optional stitched leather dashboard in this interior, we don't find stitched leather door panels like we do in the larger Volvo model. There is of course still an expensive Bowers & Wilkins sound system available, and we do find real wood trim running right along the dashboard. It's a little bit difficult to film the wood trim because of the high contrast between this whitewashed wood and the charcoal dashboard. As we see with the larger Volvos, we have a distinctive center channel speaker array right there, a large touchscreen infotainment and navigation system with Apple CarPlay integration, and 2 large air vents on either side. Most of the vehicle's functions are controlled in that touchscreen infotainment display, although we do find a few physical buttons below that. Hazard light button, front and rear defoggers, track forward backward, a physical volume knob, and play pause. Behind that, we find a center console with a very similar theme to the other Volvo models. We have a small storage cubby right there in front of the shifter. Because we're in the hybrid model, we have this joystick-style toggle shifter that's made of crystal. We toggle it all the way back for the braking mode, 1 up for drive, 1 up from there for neutral, 1 up from there for reverse, and if you want to park it, we press this park button right here. To the right of the shifter, we have a roller cover that hides a 12-volt power port, a square cup holder, and 2 larger round cup holders. Then on this side, we have the engine start-stop toggle. We toggle it clockwise to both start and stop the engine. There's a drive mode button right down here. This allows you to switch between all-wheel drive, the pure EV mode, hybrid mode, power mode, off-road, and of course an individual mode. Because of the positioning of the hybrid battery pack, we don't find a terribly large storage cubby here in the center console, although we still find 2 USB inputs and enough room to put larger smartphones. On the driver's side, we find a full LCD instrument cluster. We have a moving map display in the center section that can be replaced with infotainment, or it can be disabled. The display changes based on the drive mode that you're in. Because we're in the hybrid drive mode, you'll notice we have no tachometer over here on the right. Instead, we have a hybrid gauge. Switching to the power mode or the all-wheel drive mode replaces this display with a tachometer. Pure is what Volvo calls their EV-only drive mode. You'll notice that the display changes over here just a little bit. This helps allow you to stay in the EV-only envelope. You can think of this sort of as a power gauge. The needle will climb right over here on this little lightning bolt side until it reaches this little white dot there. Then if you need more power than that, you'll turn on the gasoline engine over here to the right. Keep in mind that 400 horsepower maximum is what ends up right over here on the other side of this gauge, and 87 horsepower is right over here at that white point, so it's not exactly a linear scale. The steering wheel is the same basic design as in the XC90. We have sport grips up top, buttons for the radar adaptive cruise control over here on the left, buttons for the infotainment system over here on the right. These also double to control that multifunction LCD instrument cluster, a voice command button, and then a menu button for that LCD system. The instrument cluster is not as configurable as the Audi MMI instrument cluster, but this is where you'd find things like your trip computer, navigation turn-by-turn directions. You can also interact with the media system and your phone, as long as you're not using the Apple CarPlay interface. Even though the mission of the XC60 T8 Hybrid is a little bit different than some of the other performance compact crossovers, this is still incredibly quick 0 to 60. We clocked that acceleration run in 4.9 seconds, which is actually faster than the Audi SQ5 and just about the same as the Mercedes-Benz GLC43 AMG. And the GLC43 is very, very quick. The Audi SQ5 feels a little bit faster than this if you brake torque the engine, but you'll still only be getting 5.1 seconds 0 to 60, just as the manufacturer suggests. Acceleration in the Volvo is a little bit different, because if you don't brake torque the SQ5, you just take your foot right off the brake pedal and put it on the gas pedal, it actually is a little bit slower, 0 to 60 in 5.4 to 5.5 seconds in our tests out here in Oregon. However, the XC60, even with the engine off, went from 0 to 60 in 4.9 seconds, and you can thank the electric motors for that. And then of course, once the engine is fully engaged, we get 472 peak pound-feet of torque, which is an awful lot of torque for a small crossover like this. The other difference in the way the XC60 applies its power is that we only get 84 horsepower to the rear axle. That means we're going to have over 300 horsepower just on the front tires. And that means that we get the faintest hint of torque steer in the XC60 while you're accelerating, but just in the T8 version. The T6 version doesn't do that because, of course, it has a mechanical all-wheel drive system. It also means that if you're turning your wheels ever so slightly, especially on a less than perfect surface, and you floor this vehicle, you're going to get a little bit of front wheel peel. And that means that in terms of general driving dynamics, the T8 version, although faster than the SQ5, has very, very different driving dynamics. Because the SQ5 sends the majority of its power to the rear axle, this is always going to be sending the majority of its power to the front axle. That has a definite impact on power on handling. So if we're going around these corners and I start putting a little bit more throttle into the XC60, this is not going to handle quite like the SQ5. Now, some of that admittedly has to do with the tires that we find on this vehicle. They're just not as grippy as what we find on the Audi. Some of that has to do with the tires, and some has to do with the fact that this is a decent amount heavier than the SQ5. That's because I have a huge lithium-ion battery pack right here under my right arm. Thanks to the air suspension, I'm going to give this an A when it comes to our overall ride score. This has a sporty quality to it when you put it in the adaptive sport mode, but it also softens out nicely when you're doing everyday driving. Now, this is still going to be a little bit firmer than something like a Lincoln MKX or a Lincoln MKC or a Cadillac XT5, which I suppose you could compare to the Volvo, but in general, those American luxury vehicles are tuned towards the softer side of things. We haven't been able to cabin noise test the XC60 out here in Oregon, but I'm going to guess this is going to be right around 72 to 71 decibels. This seems to be a little bit louder in terms of overall road noise than the Mercedes-Benz GLC, however, it's fairly similar to the SQ5. The biggest difference between this and the Germans really out on the road is going to be the engine noise when it comes to the cabin noise score. We do get a little bit more engine noise out of this four-cylinder engine under hard acceleration, and it's a little bit less pleasing than the sound that comes out of the SQ5. It's a decent amount less pleasing than what comes out of the GLC43 AMG because that engine has an absolutely incredible exhaust note. In terms of overall fuel economy, I have no doubt that you could get 26 miles per gallon or 27 miles per gallon out of this vehicle. We did have a very high fuel economy score the last last time we drove the T8 version of the XC90, but because we have been driving this car pretty hard and having more fun than you probably should in a hybrid today, we've been averaging right around 18 miles per gallon. You should keep in mind, of course, that producing 400 horsepower is going to take a decent amount of fuel, regardless of whether you're doing that out of a 2-liter 4-cylinder engine or a larger 3-liter V6. Now we should talk about how the power happens in this car. Of course, we only have 316 horsepower out of the engine, but 400 horsepower total. The way that happens, of course, is through the hybrid system. But this is not a hybrid system like we find in a Prius or a Camry or something like that. Something like a Toyota Prius has a very small battery pack. So even though the engine is producing the majority of the power, peak power can only happen for a relatively limited amount of time because you're going to drain the battery pack and then you're going to be reduced to just what the engine can do for you. Of course, even if you do reduce the power to just what the engine can produce for you, you've still got about 320 horsepower under the hood, so the XC60 is still going to be fairly quick even if the battery was absolutely flat. This electric all-wheel drive system behaves a little bit differently than the electric all-wheel drive system we find in the Lexus NX or the Lexus RX. Those hybrid vehicles don't have an off-road mode like we find in the Volvo T8 system. The Volvo T8 system all-wheel drive mode allows the car to try and apportion power more equitably front to rear, and it's thanks to this larger battery pack. The battery pack we find in the NX and the RX just doesn't have the ability to do that. So this vehicle, if you start getting into a sticky situation and you need a little bit more power on both axles, what it will do is try and send the exact same amount of power to the rear as the engine is producing up front, right up until you hit about 160 to 170 horsepower total. When that mode is engaged, this is going to feel an awful lot more sure-footed out on rougher roads, on gravel roads, snow, ice, etc. And that's been a common complaint about the Lexus hybrid systems that we find in those two vehicles. We don't find that same sort of thing going on in the Volvo. The important thing to remember overall about the T8 is that this is just not the same kind of vehicle as the GLC 43 AMG or the Audi SQ5 or the upcoming BMW X3M. Even though this is, again, just as fast as the Mercedes and actually faster than the Audi. Under normal driving conditions, this is going to be notably faster than the Audi, again, because the Audi driver is going to have to brake torque their vehicle in order to get that 5.1 second 0 to 60. And on this one, you just take your foot off the brake, mash the go pedal, and bang, 4.9 seconds later, you're operating at highway speeds. But this is not going to go around a corner like those other vehicles, because this is tuned for a softer ride. Volvo put all-season tires on the car, not a performance tire like we find in those other models. And of course, this is a plug-in hybrid, so in many ways, this doesn't really compete directly with those other options in the luxury crossover segment, even though it's just about as fast. Value has long been a strong selling point for Volvo, and that continues with the all-new 2018 XC60. The T8 model that we've been driving today starts at $52,900. That's less expensive than a GLC 43 AMG, a Jaguar F-Pace S, or of course an Audi SQ5. And of course, because this is a plug-in vehicle, it also qualifies for a $5,000 federal tax incentive. Of course, you should consult a tax professional before you depend on that $5,000 credit. If that credit does apply to you, you could get the sticker price down to about $48,000 starting. The model that we've been driving here ended up right around $71,000 because this is essentially fully loaded. Although that does sound like an awful lot of cash, it is still less expensive than many of its direct competitors. Now, this is not quite the same thing as the direct competition, however. That's primarily, of course, because of the plug-in hybrid system that this car has. It's considerably heavier. The hybrid system adds at least 500 pounds, depending on how you compare this to the T6 all-wheel drive model. It's also important to keep in mind that this is a front-wheel drive biased vehicle. We get 400 horsepower total, but only 87 of those ponies can ever go to the rear wheels. This is basically the same thing that goes on in the XC90 T8 hybrid or the new Volvo S90 T8 hybrid. The T8 will definitely get you faster 0 to 60, and of course, if you live in the state of California, you can drive this in the carpool lane all by yourself because it qualifies for California's green sticker program. Although this may not handle like a number of the competitors in this particular segment, it is actually faster than a large number of them. It's just not necessarily one of the best handling options. This is a little bit more comfortable. It's definitely more luxury oriented, even in the R design trim, than we see out of something like the GLC 43. After years without much change, this segment is all of a sudden becoming incredibly competitive. We have an all-new GLC, we have an all-new Jaguar F-Pace, the XC60 has of course been completely redesigned, as has been the Audi Q5 and SQ5. As I've said before, manufacturers don't generally design their cars to be class middling, so we have a group of competitors that are all fighting for the top dog position, and that means that all of them have been pretty good deals for 2018. If you want excellent handling in your compact crossover, take a look at something like the Jaguar F-Pace. But if you want one of the best interiors, take a look at the Volvo XC60. Be sure and let me know what you think about the 2018 XC60 T8 down there in the comment section below. Be sure and stay tuned for our complete reviews on the XC60 T6 and T8 coming up soon. And we will also have some videos on the all-new GLC 43 AMG and the Audi SQ5 coming up very, very soon. I'll see you next week.